This week, a man named Peter K. Newman of Dayton, Ohio, writes a letter to the editor of the Wall Street Journal. And in the letter to the editor, he tells the following joke. I am quoting Peter Newman's joke exactly. A departing CEO met with his successor, presented him with 3 numbered envelopes, and advised him to open these if he ran into any trouble. After sales and profits dropped during the next quarter, the new CEO opened the first envelope. It contained the message, "Blame your predecessor." The company continued to struggle during the next 2 quarters, so the new CEO opened the second envelope. It contained the message, "Distract your critics by reorganizing." Finally, because the company's year-end results were still disappointing, the new CEO rushed to his office and opened the third envelope. It contained the message, "Prepare 3 envelopes." This joke is no joke. This joke is about the human problem. What happens when we have patterns that are not working for us? What happens when we have patterns where we are not thriving? Now, it may be that we inherited the pattern from the previous CEO, or it may be our own bad habits, but we're dealing with a pattern that is not working. And this joke invites us to consider the consequences of what happens when we don't fix our patterns that are not working. Since the new CEO couldn't fix the reality that had sabotaged the old CEO, the new CEO shares the same fate. And we're left with this joke that is no joke, wondering, when we encounter patterns in our own lives that are not working, how do we change the map? And that is all of our problem, and that is all of our challenge now. And something came out this week that kind of concretizes the universality of our problem. It's the Oxford Word of the Year for 2022. So you may know that every year the Oxford Dictionary comes out with a Word of the Year. And every year, that Word of the Year kind of captures the big storyline of that year. So in 2016, the Word of the Year was post-truth. In 2018, the Word of the Year was toxic. In 2020, of course, pandemic. In 2021, it was vax. So this week, the Oxford Dictionary Word of the Year is, drumroll, a word that I had never heard of before and didn't even know what it meant. I had to look it up. Goblin mode. Goblin mode is the word of the year. So here is the dictionary definition of goblin mode. The slang term describes a type of behavior which is unapologetically self-indulgent, lazy, slovenly, greedy, typically in a way that rejects social norms or expectations. Here's the kicker. That got 93% of the vote. Now, who would ever do such a thing? Who would ever do unapologetically self-indulgent, lazy, slovenly, greedy, rejecting social norms? Who would do such a thing? And the answer is, I would, you would, we all would. We all have done and we all do goblin mode even before I knew there was a term, goblin mode. Remember, goblin mode reflects the storyline of the year 2022. And I think in a deep way it is about the habits that we picked up during a pandemic, that at first were a pandemic necessity and have become a bad habit that we can't shake. At first, The pandemic nurtured this ethic of inwardness and retreat and isolation. I'm going to be focused on my own home, my own hearth, my own health, my own life. I'm not going to get out. And that was a necessity, and now it's a kind of a bad habit that we can't shake. So we used to binge watch Netflix, because what else were we going to do? And now we binge watch Netflix or Hulu or Peacock or Amazon Prime because we like it. We used to hang out a lot over the weekends at home, maybe in our pajamas, not showering, not really seeing other people, not getting on our social face, a lot of time alone, because we had to. Now we do it because we like it. We like it. We used to do stuff. Now we make sourdough bread because we like it. Now, what's wrong with doing that? What's wrong if we just spend our weekends binge watching Netflix? Is there anything wrong with that? So it's not a problem for a weekend. In fact, if you want to spend tomorrow binge watching White Lotus Season 2, go for it. The finale is Sunday night at 9 o'clock. It's not a problem for a particular weekend, but what's the long-term problem of staying in this secluded, my own home, my own health, my own hearth, my own life, me? What's the problem with that long-term? And there is a long-term problem, and it is simply this. The problem is what I call the self-absorption paradox. And the self-absorption paradox is very simple, and I think its logic is ineluctable. And it simply teaches this, that the more self-absorbed we are, the less consequential our life. The more self-absorbed we are, the less happy we are. And the less self-absorbed we are, the more consequential our life. And the less self-absorbed we are, the happier we are. Which is to say what you already know, that spending the entire weekend baking sourdough bread and watching Netflix is not a recipe for happy. And it's not a recipe for consequential. And so the question is, how do we not be like the new CEO in that joke that's not a joke, repeating patterns that don't serve us? How do we get rid of the patterns and the habits that no longer serve us? So I think we need a new move, and the universe and the cosmos and the Jewish universe is whispering our new move. What is the very opposite of goblin mode? And the very opposite of goblin mode is just on our calendar now. We're about to mark the 50th Yortzeit of one of the truly great Jewish writers, thinkers, rabbis, and activists ever, certainly the 20th century, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was born in Poland in 1907 and died in New York December 23rd, 1972. Now, Heschel's biography is so important. He's born the worst place, worst time, Poland, 1907. So he knows from the Shoah very personally. His mother and 3 of his sisters all perish in the Shoah. And he comes to this country having experienced unimaginable loss and unimaginable grief. And here's Heschel's iconic move. And it's in books that are like this, but actually just in the title of his main book, you get the point. His main point is, don't say, where was God? Say instead that God is asking, where are we? Where is human decency? And thus, the iconic title of his book, God in Search of Man, God in Search of Us. That our job is to do what he called a leap of action, do something concrete that helps somebody else. So he didn't just write it, he lived it. He himself was the opposite of goblin mode. He could have been very happy doing goblin mode before we knew the term. He could have never left his apartment, just typed his great books. He could have never left his classrooms at the seminary, just teaching his students. But he actually put himself out there. He wrote a stinging letter to President John Kennedy on June 16th, 1963, and he says to him, "Mr. President, we need moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. We need a Marshall Plan for Black Americans." And then he backs it up. He goes to Selma with Dr. King in 1965, and there he encounters deep hostility. And Heschel embodies the self-absorption paradox. Remember, the less self-absorbed, the more consequential. The less self-absorbed, the more your life matters, which is why we're still talking about him 50 years later. We're still reading about him 50 years later, which is why schools are named for him. But you don't have to be Heschel to answer God's call. One day, about 10 or 11 years ago, I got a call that I'll never forget. Got a call from a woman who was then 86 years old, named Harriet Binder. And she said to me, "Did you want to buy Mother's Day cards?" So I was surprised by the call because it was February. And I said, "Okay, but why? Why February Mother's Day cards? Mother's Day's in May." And she says she does these Mother's Day cards. She calligraphies them by hand. She draws flowers by hand. And she uses the money and gives it to Hadassah. So I said, "Okay, but how much is that card?" And she said, "It's $10, $11. And to my eternal credit, I didn't say I could get it for less at CVS. I said, "I'll take 3 of them. I'll take 3 for the women in my life." Back in those days, the good old days, I got one for my mother and one for my mother-in-law, and I got one for Shira, who technically is not my mother, but I still thought it was prudent to do that. And ever since then, I've been getting these cards from Harriet Binder, and she has done 7,000 cards over the last 10 years. And when I say 7,000 cards, each card is done by hand. So she paints a flower by hand. She calligraphies a note by hand. She calligraphies the envelope that comes in by hand. She puts the stamp in by tongue, and she mails it. And she's done that 7,000 times. And I said to her, "Harriet, why do you do this?" And she said she would love to give money to Hadassah, but she doesn't have that much money. But what she can give is sustained labor of love. She has raised over $70,000 this way. And then I said to her, "Why Hadassah?" And she said she remembers as a little girl, this is now 90 years ago. 90 years ago, when she was in Dorchester, she would walk around with a pushki, and she would ask people for their change, and the through line was to redeem the land of Israel. And she collected money when she was 6, and now at 86 and 96, she's collecting money through her flowers to redeem the land of Israel. That's what we need to do. I think goblin mode is a wake-up call. We need to learn new habits. We need to shed old habits. We need to be back with people making a difference. For the Oxford Dictionary Word of the Year for 2023, I'd love to propose that we create an old word that becomes the word of the year. Hineni. Here I am, God, ready to do my part to make this a better world. Please rise.